Hello, welcome to the video of the lecture. Again, my name is Dr. Faith Inman, and I'm your biostatistics professor. And this lecture one will be on statistical processes and graph types. I'm going to give you a general sort of 10,000 foot overview of the process of doing statistics. Some of this will probably be familiar to you from other science classes that you've had. To begin with, we start by considering the current state of knowledge. The current state of knowledge is what we already know, right? What we already know or other people know. And from there, we construct a testable hypothesis. Then we go on to design the experiment, perform the experiment, do the statistical analysis, and then interpret and report the results, which should contribute back to the current state of knowledge. This is the circular flow of scientific learning. It's an iterative process, and you can become part of it. Up until now, you've mostly been consumers of knowledge, but as you develop in your abilities throughout your education, you can start to become the producers of knowledge, people who add to the knowledge pool through this process. Research steps. There are many ways of discussing this. I break it down into 5 steps. Step 1, define a question. What do you want to know? Step 2, do some background research. What's already known? Step 3, design the experiment. What will you measure and how will you measure it? What analysis will you use? Important. It's important to make sure you plan the analysis you're going to do while you're planning your experimental design. That's going to save you a lot of trouble in the long run. So that's part of step 3. Step 4, analyze the data. Step 5, interpret the results in light of the questions, background, and hypotheses. So we're going to focus a lot on the data analysis, exploring the data, making summary statistics, graphs, checking the assumptions. Each statistical test has a set of assumptions, or another word for that would be the criteria, the prerequisites, if you will, that have to be met for that test to be valid. And if you can meet the assumptions, you do the formal hypothesis testing, and that allows you to properly interpret the results by going back to the question. What's the background? What were my hypotheses? How did I answer this question? And then what do these results mean? Do they support or refute previous studies? What evidence did we get from our experiment or observational study to support our conclusion? And here's where you would put in the p-values, graphs, etc. I'm going to go into each one of these steps in more detail in the next slides. So step 1, defining the question. Defining the question is usually one of the most difficult parts. When we look at the world, we have a lot of questions, right? Lots of questions. I mean, you do. Right now, if I say to you, hey, do you have a question? You're gonna be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I have no questions. I have nothing in my mind. It's a total blank. But reality is we always like go out and we find things that we want to know something about. Me, I'm constantly coming up with questions and thinking, how would you test that? You know, like I know this guy and he makes cookies using avocado pits. He puts avocado pits in his cookies. And I thought, well, that could be interesting. I mean, I've heard avocado oil is very healthy, and otherwise everyone's just throwing these away. Like that could be a great idea, but I'm not sure if it's safe. Is it? Right? So I looked it up and I could find very little information about it. And I thought, how could you test it? How could you find out? Maybe we should design an experiment. Right? What would I want to know? What I want to know is it a good idea to put avocado pits in cookies? Are they safe? So our sampling universe would be the population about which you want to talk. And here in this graphic, I have lots of little people, right? Lots of little people. Let's imagine these are students, right? And let's imagine that our sampling universe, what we want to make inferences about isn't just humans, like all humans. We want to talk about college students, right? Like you. We want to talk about college students. We want to say something about maybe something that we've already collected data on, like the age. Remember on the first day of class, we all collected data on our ages. What is, say, the average age of college students in where? That's how you define the universe. Are you talking about in the world, in the United States? Let's say at UH Hilo. Or you could even just say, you know, our class. But let's say you wanted to know the average age of college students at UH Hilo. Well, it'd be kind of hard to go and measure all of them. Not impossible, it's a finite number, but people join and they drop out. That number keeps changing. So really measuring absolutely everybody to do a complete census is really difficult. So usually what we do in statistics is we take a sample, and usually it's a random sample. So you would randomly assign everybody a number or use a number they already have, like their social security number or their student number or their telephone number, and you'd pick those numbers at random. And you would pick from that population in that random way. And if you do it right, that small sample that you measure of the larger population will be representative of the larger population. And there are many tools in statistics that we use, and I'll teach you some of these. You'll be using them. How to account for the uncertainty that's inherent in measuring a sample instead of measuring a population, right? Because even though the sample should be representative of the population, if you've measured it right, if you've taken a random sample, it's likely to be a little bit different. There's going to be some uncertainty there. So we have ways of accounting for that and measuring that and presenting it so that everyone can be on the same page. Like, oh, okay, so the average is, 25 plus or minus 2 years, right? You've seen this, right? You've seen estimates where there's plus or minus something, right? That usually comes from doing a statistical analysis that gives you either a standard deviation or a confidence interval or something like that. We'll go into it more. So the first thing you have to do is say, what do you want to know? And you define your sampling universe or the area of inference. Okay, then you do some background research. Background research helps you to define the knowledge gaps. Let's say, again, I wanted to know about avocado pits and cookies. I started off by going to Google. Was there any information online? Did it say anything? Well, the Avocado Association said, we don't really recommend it, but I couldn't find anything that really said why or that it had been tested. I couldn't find exactly what was going on. So I found this interesting knowledge gap. Maybe that not the most interesting knowledge gap unless you're living in a place where people have a lot of avocados and they're trying to figure out what to do with all the pits. But I thought it was interesting. Or let's say, again, talking about our class, you want to know what's the average age of college students. Maybe you think you're right about average, or maybe you think you're a little young or you're a little old and you want to know, like, how much older or younger am I than everybody else? Am I right in that range? Am I about normal? Am I normal? How do you define normal? In statistics, we do. We define normal. We'll get to that later. So you start by doing background research to define the knowledge gaps that would be interesting to fill. Sources of information, Google Scholar is amazing. It's great. There's so much on there. I mean, that didn't exist when I was going to college. It's such a gift. There's also other online resources. Be careful, of course, of many online resources that if they're trying to sell you something, they're often trying to push their point of view. Some of them are not credible. You know very well that you can post anything online. You yourself can make a website and post anything you want to online, and it can be nonsense. And right, the buyer beware when it comes to the internet. But some are good sources, and you can usually tell that those are good sources because they're citing peer-reviewed publications, right? Somebody has looked at the sources of data and evaluated them independently to say, yeah, this sounds like it was reasonably well constructed as a study, and their results appear to be somewhat valid, or they've done any kind of a study. They're not just sort of making things up, which is most of what I see online. If you ever look online and you notice like one web page says one thing and then the next page says almost exactly the same thing, like almost word for word, like they're just copying and pasting from the other website, and then you keep going back and you try to find the source and there's no data. Like, where's the data on that? Anyway, the library. There's this place, this beautiful, magical, quiet place. It's cool. It's air conditioned. You might want to just go there for that. It's called the library. And did you know that at Hilo you have to register to use the online resources at the library? I did not know that. I have been living in ignorance. I finally just saw that in an online with the Hilo. I'm going to say it's a credible source because they put it out. And it said, if you really want to be able to access all of the resources of the library that are being paid for by the library, by your tuition and the state, that you have to register. Registering as a student isn't enough. You have to separately register for the library. It takes a minute to do, but it takes them a couple days to process. So do it right away. Don't wait till the last minute. And I've included a link here, register. Just click on that, go in and do it. Might as well have it out of the way. You just type in your name, your ID number. Another source of information could be experts. You can talk to people who know something about something, right? You yourself might be an expert. Your own knowledge and observations probably give you a lot of really good background information. Like, let's say I asked you, what's the average age of college students? And I'm not going to give you the number. I'm going to say, would you guess that they're between 5 and 15 years old, 16 and 25 years old, or between 26 and 35 years old, right? A, B, or C. What would you guess? It's not going to be A. They're probably not between 5 and 15. B, more likely, they're probably going to be somewhere around that range of 15 to 25, probably more around like 18, 20, 25, right? Could be older, and different populations might be different, but you already have some knowledge about the world that you can apply to the background of your research to give you an idea about what's interesting to study, what's not known, what would you like to know. Here in this class, we'll use a lot of cool tools that you can apply to figure these things out. So that's exciting. That's exciting. Next, design the experiment. Now, this is a fun part. Once you know your question, you've done your background research, you can design the experiment. I don't know, can you see my face? I'll move it out of the way here. So when you design the experiment, the first step that I usually use is I sketch it out. I'm very visual. I like to draw it. I make a picture. I say, okay, like if I was to design an experiment on looking at the effects of fertilizer on plant growth, like in the schematic here, right? What's the effects of fertilizer on plant growth? I think, well, I'm going to have a little pot, not that kind of pot, a pot like a plant, pot for plants. We're going to have one pot that's the control and one pot that's the experiment. I'm going to put a plant in each one of them. One of them I'm going to give fertilizer to, the other one I'm not going to give fertilizer. I'm going to wait some time and then I'm going to measure the height. And I'm going to maybe do that several times, because maybe just by a chance that one pot with the fertilizer also had more sunlight. And so maybe it would grow more anyway. Or maybe the cat knocked it over and then you put it back real quick. Or maybe the cat knocked it over and your roommate put it back and you didn't see it and you're like, it's weird. I thought fertilizer would make the plants grow, but this one's totally dying. I guess fertilizer isn't good for plants after all, right? But no, That's not it. That's why you want to do it several times so that hopefully the cat doesn't knock over all of them. And you think I'm kidding, but this happens. All right. So once you've sketched it out, the next step, and you will hear me ask you this when it comes time for you to do your own projects. I'm going to say to you, what's your explanatory and what's your response variable? If you can't answer that clearly, you need to do some more thinking about it, because that's the crucial thing. If you can define your explanatory and response variables, then it helps you to decide what kind of analysis you want to do or you can do, and helps you to create a good experiment. Poorly defined explanatory and response variables, like you have this question, like I remember last semester we had some students and they say, well, we're like, we want to see, like, we want to measure like if being outside makes pigs healthy. And I'm like, well, so health is your response variable, but how are you going to measure that? Like, how do you measure health of a pig? Could be lots of ways. I don't know, like their blood pressure. I don't, right? So you have to think about how you're actually going to measure it. So in the case of this little experiment here on the slide, it tells you fertilizer is the independent variable. Heads up, in stats, we have a lot of synonyms. It happens all the time, all the time. I'll point it out to you whenever I can, but very often these terms are used interchangeably, and it can be confusing at times. But the word explanatory variable and the word independent variable, these two terms mean the same thing, really, right? These are what you would put on your x-axis. That's another way we would say it. Your x variable, your independent variable, your explanatory variable, same thing, right? This is the fertilizer, the thing that's making something happen, the thing that's having an effect on the other thing, right? And then in this slide, you see it says plant growth is dependent variable. Again, another synonym, dependent variable. Up here, I wrote response variable. Same thing, means the same thing. Two different terms, just synonyms. The dependent variable or the response variable is the variable that you will measure, that you think is going to be affected by the independent variable. That's the response is affected by the explanatory variable. In this case, plant growth, we think, will be affected by fertilizer, right? Fertilizer, independent or explanatory variable, plant growth, dependent or response variable, right? And usually, again, your independent variable, if you were doing a plot, would usually be on your x-axis, your horizontal axis, and your dependent or response variable will be on the y or vertical axis, right? So you would call that your x variable, your y variable, independent, dependent, explanatory, response, right? You'll get used to it. And then you can ask, what's your data type? Once you know what your explanatory and response variables are, then what are your data types? Are they categorical? Are they numeric? That's key, right? Are you measuring plant growth in terms of a general category like big, little, medium, right? Is it a category like that? Or are you going to measure it in terms of, let's say, centimeters? Then you'd have a numeric variable. The kind of analysis you do depends a lot on the way you measure things and the type of data that you collect, right? So fertilizer could also be a categorical variable or a numeric variable. Let's say instead of just fertilizer, yes, no, you have 3 different kinds of fertilizer. Let's say you have 3 different brands of fertilizer. Yeah, 3 different kinds, 3 different brands. These would be 3 different categories. In that case, your explanatory variable would be categorical. And let's say instead you said, no, I'm not going to do 3 different kinds. I'm just going to get one kind of fertilizer because the bags of fertilizer are so expensive. I'm going to buy one bag and it's a big bag. I've got plenty of it. I'm just going to put different amounts of fertilizer on the plants and see how well they grow. I'm going to have either 10 grams, 20 grams, or 30 grams of fertilizer that I'm going to put on the plants, 3 different treatments. Now you've got a numeric variable. You could also call it high, medium, and low and use it as a categorical, or you could use it as 10, 20, 30 as a numeric variable, right? Again, this defines your statistical analysis, what your variables are and what your data types are. So what's your treatment? That's kind of another way of saying what's your explanatory variable? What's your treatment? If you're doing an experiment, you will have a treatment. An experiment is different from an observational study because in an experiment, you actually do some manipulation, where an observational study, you just watch it grow. Like if you went out to look at plants that are growing in a place where the soil is very fertile versus a place where the soil is not fertile and you measured their growth, but you're not changing anything, that's an observational study. But if you're adding fertilizer, then that's an experiment. Okay, we'll go over that more too. And then you could say, well, how many observations do you have? If you did this experiment as it's sketched out here, it looks like you have, I know it has like 3 here, but this is just one plant, one pot. And they're showing we have 2 identical pots. You put just water in this one, you put fertilizer and water in the other one, and then one of them grows not that much and the other one grows more and has flowers, right? But it's really just 2 pots, right? And how many times do you measure it? Do you measure it throughout the course of the experiment? Do you take several observations? Or do you just have one observation per pot? If you have just one observation per pot, you really just have what we call an N of 1 or one replicate, right? So that's usually not enough. Again, the cat can knock it down. The roommate's not going to tell you because they're like, oh, my cat wasn't supposed to be here anyway. And then, right. So you always want to have many observations in your experiment, like at least 6 pots with the fertilizer and 6 without. And I'm sure one of you guys are going to choose this as a group project. It's a no-brainer. It's so easy. I think I've got a bunch of pots and soil. You just get some seeds. We could do this. So what units will you measure your samples in? What statistical test will you use? How much power will you have for it? What resources do you need in terms of tools, money, time, ability? Is this something that you know how to do? Is this something you're going to have to learn or get help? And experiments usually are expensive and they're going to take time. And sometimes you'll need some different tools. And remember, in this class for your project, we have no money, no budget, 0. It's up to you. I don't want you to spend too much time on it. Some, not too much. You have a lot to do. I know you're busy with other classes as well. And we have some tools, not that much, but we have some scales and we've got some tools to help you out when you come to that. I like that you're already thinking about it. So design the experiment, step 3. Step 4. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of individuals, variables, and data types. I just want to put this in here while we're talking about it. So again, another set of synonyms to be aware of is individual, observation, and sample. These 3 terms are used interchangeably, but I think this is kind of confusing because when you talk about taking a sample, sometimes what you're talking about is like taking a sample of a population that could include many individuals. And you might record several observations on each individual within that sample, right? But at the same time, people use these terms interchangeably, where sometimes they say, I collected 20 samples. And that means they actually collected 20 measurements on 5 individuals of a sample, something like that, right? So pay attention. I tend to use the term observation because I think that's the least ambiguous. It's the most clear. And if you think about it, if you imagine a spreadsheet, each record, each horizontal row in the data should be one observation, right? That's one observation. A variable is a thing that varies. Good, right? Another way of thinking about it is it's a characteristic of an individual that could have different values for each individual. So for example, that age or weight or coat color of a golden retriever, right? I like dogs, they're so fun. And then data types. I want you to pay close attention to this slide and how we see there are qualitative and quantitative variables. And within qualitative variables, we have nominal and ordinal variables and discrete and continuous variables. Oh, let's go back there. Great. Qualitative. Another word for qualitative, synonym alert, is categorical. It represents the quality of something, but not necessarily a numeric measurement of it. So a qualitative or categorical measurement could be either nominal or ordinal. Nominal would be names, right? That's what nominal means, names. So for example, the student names, like we collected these data already. We collected nominal data on ourselves, right? We collected our names. Ordinal would be a special kind of categorical data where the categories have an inherent order to them. For example, class standing, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, right? There's an inherent order to them. You start as a freshman, then you go to being a sophomore, and then a junior, and then a senior, right? So you could also think about stars of hotels, right? You ever look at reviews of hotels, you say, oh, this is a 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, 5-star hotel, or if you go on online to buy something, you see the reviews. How many stars did this get, right? And the number of stars is a category that represents an order. It's not exactly the same thing as a number, though, because a 1-star hotel isn't half as good as a 2-star hotel, and a 4-star hotel isn't necessarily double the quality of a 2-star hotel. It doesn't exactly work that way. So these are not numbers that we can put on a number line and do the same kind of math with them that we can with ordinary numbers. They're really categories. Or we have lots of examples of this, but just be aware of them. Sometimes when you're doing statistics, often you'll see numbers that look like, well, they're numbers. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But they're not really representing numbers. They're representing categories, and often these are ordinal variables. They have an order to them. Quantitative, another synonym for quantitative is numeric. Qualitative, categorical, quantitative, numeric. It's something that can be counted or measured for an individual. There are 2 types of quantitative variables, 2 types of numeric variables, discrete and continuous. And this is a little bit tricky. It's a little bit tricky. Don't sweat it if you don't totally get it at first. Just know that it exists. So discrete variables are limited in the range, like the number of dots on a dice. You can just keep rolling the dice and you're always going to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, right? There are only so many values that it can take. That's a discrete variable. A continuous variable could theoretically take any number, and usually can also take fractions of a number. A discrete value can also take fractions, but it's more important to think that a discrete is bounded, whereas continuous is like a number line that goes on infinitely. So the continuous variable, let's see, student age. Student age is actually a continuous variable. Theoretically, it could include people of any age from 1 to 100, of which it's still bounded. You see, it's a little bit tricky. It's like, yeah, but it is still bounded. I mean, the human beings only live so far, right? It's not infinite. You couldn't have less than one, and realistically, you're not going to have a 1-year-old. You're going to have a certain age range. But theoretically, age can take on a very large number of values. So even though you could argue that it's discrete, the number of values, the range of values that it can take on is pretty big enough that it acts as a continuous variable. And sometimes discrete variables act like that, and sometimes continuous variables act like discrete variables. When you graph them, it'll help you to see. You'll get used to this. I'm just going to let you know right now, sorry, but stats is like that. It's not an exact science. It is, and it isn't. There's a lot of art to it. There's a lot of just practicing and looking at things and getting used to how numbers should look. Just come along with me. We'll get there. Next. Analyze the data. Oh, there's the fun part, right? We get to crunch the numbers and do the code and things happen. So start with exploratory data analysis. Data checking, cleaning, graphs, check assumptions. I'm going to see if my mic is actually working here. Hang on. Yeah, it's on. Okay. I am recording this while no one is here because I forgot to record it during the actual class. So I'm just talking to myself, pretending you're there. Analyze the data. Step 1, do an exploratory data analysis. That means check the data. Just look at it to see, okay, does it look okay? I mean, is there something weird going on here? Clean the data. That usually means make sure all the numbers are numbers. Make sure all the females say female and not some of them say F, and that they're all either capital or lowercase, right? That's part of data cleaning, is maintaining data integrity. Each field should have a certain data type, and that all the categories should be spelled the same. Believe me, this can be half of the time that you spend analyzing data can be spent in just cleaning the data. It's a major step, and it's a step that often gets ignored in traditional statistical textbooks. They forget to tell you this, but it's hugely important. Okay. So I'm going to keep it real for you guys. You got to clean your data, make some graphs. Your graph is a final product, yes, but your graph is also part of the original process of just looking at the data, exploring it. Put it up on a graph, take a look at it, and right away things will pop out on you like, well, those numbers look strange, or that's not really very normal, is it? Look at the data that way. And then there is a formal process for each test to check the assumptions. Each test, each statistical procedure has a set of assumptions that go with it. Like, you got to check off these boxes. And if you can check them off, more or less, then you can do the analysis and your results will be valid. If you can't, you can still do the analysis, but sometimes your results won't mean what they think they mean. And you could be really misrepresenting the reality, which is like lying, which is lame. So don't do that, right? If your data meet the assumptions, then you go on to doing the test of hypothesis testing, if appropriate. Now, some data aren't appropriate for that. In fact, at the end of class, if we can get that far, I want to introduce you to some non-hypothesis testing statistics that are really, really powerful and useful. They don't give you an answer of yes, no, but they give you a lot of insight into your data. Next, exploratory data analysis. Okay, I'm going to go into this a little bit more. Always do this before the formal hypothesis testing. You got to find the mistakes. You got to check the assumptions. You got to determine relationships among the explanatory variables. Let's say you didn't just add fertilizer to your plants. Let's say you added fertilizer and you also put some in the sun and some not in the sun. Well, could there be a relationship between these two? or let's say you did an experiment with where you added water and fertilizer, and you add different levels of water and fertilizer. Well, plants that have more water might be able to better use more fertilizer. That's actually not a very good example. Should think of a better example than that. We'll get to that. Wait, let me think. Okay, we'll come up with some stuff. Things that relate to each other. Oh yeah, we had this one where we looked at. Oh yeah, hopefully we'll still get to do this. Last semester we measured the length and the width of lemons, and we weighed them, right? And we wanted to see if you could predict the weight of the lemons based on the length or the width, right? So the weight was the response variable, and the length and the width were the explanatory variables. But length and width themselves are correlated, right? So there's a relationship among the two explanatory variables of length and width, which means that if you put both of them into an analysis, you might be better able to predict weight, but probably putting both of them in there would be sort of what's called overfitting the analysis, and it's not recommended. Okay, it explained it. Okay, and then putting things on graphs gives you an idea, or at least a rough idea, of relationships among the explanatory and outcome variables. Outcome variable, there's another word for it. Another word for response variable or dependent variable. Outcome variable, response variable, dependent variable, Y variable. 4 different ways of saying it. All right, keep track. And then you select the appropriate model based on this exploratory analysis. How? How do you do all this exploratory analysis? Again, you make graphs. You calculate the summary or descriptive statistics. Summary statistics, descriptive statistics. Again, there's some synonyms there. They mean about the same thing. This is like the minimum, the maximum, the mean, the mode, the median, the standard deviation. These are summary statistics, the count, how many, right? Stuff you can do almost with a calculator, most of it with a calculator. These really basic descriptive or summary statistics actually tell you a lot about your data, right? And in fact, sometimes that's what we want to know. We want to know about. We want to know, is the minimum different between two samples? Is the mean different between two samples, right? And then again, look at the data, look at the data, look at the data. Did I say look at the data? Yeah, just look at it, like look at it. I know for most of the data that we are going to collect, and we're going to do lots of data collection. I hope this is all going to work out. We're going to collect lots of data and we're going to look at it. And most of the time we're going to collect data on us and things that we measure. So we'll have maybe 25 observations. And you can just kind of scan through it, in the spreadsheet pretty easily. And you can it'll pop out at you like, oh, somebody wrote 100 instead of 10.0, right? You can kind of see that. If you're dealing with large amounts of data, which if you go on in statistics, you'll probably be working with large amounts of data, like maybe millions of records, or the projects that I work on here in Hawaii, we measure 15,000 trees with multiple stems per trees measured over several years. It's like a lot of data. Then it's really hard to just like visually go through the spreadsheet and look at it, but you can look at it in other ways, like making graphs and other ways of visualizing it. This is a really, really important step, obviously, because I put the big eyeballs. It's important. Okay, then what does it all mean? I love this guy. He's really cute. What does it all mean? This is how I feel a lot. Seeking meaning. Do we accept or reject the null hypothesis? Remember, the null hypothesis, null, zero, no effect, right? then you go back to your original question and say, well, did we answer our question? How did we answer it? Did we find out that avocados were okay to put in cookies, or were they poisonous? Did we find out that the mean age of students is not that different for Hilo than the rest of the country, if that's what we were studying, or whatever it is you want to study about? And then you look back at the background research and you interpret your results in light of this background research. What do these results mean, right? If the average age of Hilo students is different than the rest of the country, do we have some explanation for that? Is there something that we can, some other information we can bring in that helps us to explain or understand why that might be? Or does this help us to support our expectation that maybe Hilo students tend to be more mature, or they're older, or they're younger because they tend to come from local families? Right. So you go back to your original question, go back to your background research, interpret it. Do they support or refute previous studies? And then what evidence do you have to support your conclusions? And this is where we have p-values, which we'll talk about a lot, graphs, etc. Okay, now we're going to go into a separate section and we're going to talk about types of graphs.